Yeah, why not? Good afternoon. There's still some seats. I know nobody likes to sit in the front row, but these are the only seats available. So you have to sit or stand in the back. And the food is in the back, the drinks are in the back, so I can see also the attraction of staying in the back, but please don't hesitate to find a seat and then we can start. And first of all, of course, to welcome you to, I was almost saying Brussels in the park, but it's Brussels to the Bay, or not Europe in the park, which we had on Saturday. So Brussels to the Bay, and I mean, I counted a bit like, well, how many times have we now done Brussels in the Bay since we opened up our office just over 2 years ago? And I think it's about 18 or 19, depending on how you count. And this was probably the one for which we had the shortest preparation time. We pulled this off in like 5 days. And so apologies for been sending an invite out late, but the fact that we have a full house again shows that it's quite popular. It's become a brand. It's something that kind of we also take pride in bringing kind of experts together. And it's actually a very simple idea. I mean, we face common challenges in the EU and in the US. I mean, protection of minors, which we of course discuss this afternoon, is one of them. And so I mean, there's plenty of opportunity and actually need to exchange views, to learn from each other, to test particular solutions. And so this is the simple idea behind Brussels to the Bay. We haven't found a stone of wisdom or a crystal ball in Europe. If you found it here, then please let us know and we're glad to borrow it. And so there's a tremendous opportunity and scope for mutual learning. As I said, we were a little distracted also last week because of Europe in the Park, and I see some faces that I don't know, I mean, some of you were at Europe in the Park, which we held on Saturday in Golden Gate Park. We turned Peacock Meadow into EU Meadow. It was like for 4 or 5 hours, it was EU territory, and it was a lot of fun. This was also for once not about the kind of rules, regulations, all the complexities that we talk about, but it was just about European culture. From the member state, we worked very closely with the 14 consulate general from San Francisco and LA, and it was song and dance and food and music and film, and so it was great. The weather could have been slightly better, but that we will take care of next year because we want to turn it into an annual tradition. I mean, before we go to the substance, I want to introduce because we were a startup when we started 2 years ago, and good startups grow, and so now we're growing a bit, and it's a good thing, and we have like a few new colleagues here. One is now currently looking to her phone, so she's, I guess, quite addicted to like social media, checking her Instagram account. But it's Giulia Geneletti. She joined us on the 1st of July, and she works, I mean, a lot on the DSA, on kind of social media, on safety and freedom of speech on the internet. Many of you might know her because she was actually our first stagiaire, our first intern at the beginning of last year, and she did so exceptionally well that of course we needed to ask her to come back, and so she's now with us full time. I'm looking at Paul John is here. Paul John Lowenthal is here for a year. He's actually in UC Davis. He's accompanying his wife who is doing a fellowship at UC Davis. Paul John is an exceptionally gifted lawyer, and he does all of the cases on DSA and DMA and other things as well. So he works for the legal service, but then for this year, he's here, but of course continues to work as if he were in Brussels, but he's also kind of part of these type of events and policy making, and we're very pleased to have him here. We have colleagues from Brussels. I mean, Martin, you will get to know. There's Annika over there, Annika Oostergren. She's the senior expert. They came over from Brussels for meetings this week here in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley. So Annika also works on protection of minors. So the team, I mean, they will go back to Brussels, but the team is expanding. We'll get a few more colleagues coming in, working on AI, working also on innovation. So that's we will have a bit more batting power, as you say, I think in baseball. But now maybe to the subject of this afternoon. And I think protection of minors is a deeply personal subject, I think, for many of us. I mean, whether we are parents or grandparents or nieces, we have our nephews and nieces. I think if you see these statistics that kids are spending like upwards of 7, 8 hours, some upwards of 10 hours on the internet per day, You see the anxieties, you see depression, you see self-harm, exposure to content for which young kids are not mentally prepared. I mean, there's a huge social experiment happening on our young kids and the young population for which nobody ever gave permission. So no surprise that both in the EU and the US, and in the US, this is one of the few bipartisan issues. I mean, Republicans and Democrats are kind of in a way aligned that there's something that needs to be done. In the EU, it's a major issue. President von der Leyen is very also personally committed to this. I mean, we have the Digital Services Act. You will hear about that this afternoon. We have guidelines in preparation to kind of flesh out what we expect, particularly social media platforms, to do in order to offer a very high level of protection to our young citizens, to our young kids. I mean, in the US, you have in the Senate, Senate passed COSA and COPPA, so for protection of minors. I mean, we have Buffy Wicks here, who passed, I mean, a few years ago, the age-appropriate design code, is very actively involved in protection of minors and many other things. So there's a lot happening, and I think we all have the feeling something, I mean, there will be need to be a breakthrough in this area. Something will have to be done in order to protect our kids and bring like back normalcy in our life. I think there's this feeling of like, we're fed up now, something needs to be done. Fortunately, also industry is starting to move. I mean, there was the teen accounts announcement of Meta, Instagram of last week. So, but you can feel there's change in the air. So this week is quite important. We are meeting with all of the experts here. We have this event here with the expert. We have a major event at Stanford on trust and safety, where also protection of minors will be a very central topic next week. Say the attention shifts to Brussels with a number of workshops, etc. So it's a good opportunity now to compare notes and to see what we can do in the future. And the future is not like years and years away. The future is actually now. With that, I'd like to introduce Rihanna Pfefferkorn. She was at Europe in the Park, so that was good to see you there. Rihanna is a policy fellow at the Center for Human AI, Human-Centered AI at Stanford, and I mean, she's a really kind of first-class scientist and working on many of these, and academic, many of these issues. So I'm going to hand over to you. You can then introduce the panel, and I would also invite you to be interactive. I mean, just participate, of course, not whilst they are speaking, but then when we have the Q&A.
Thank you, Gerard. We do only have the one mic to share among participants here, unfortunately, today. I want to start with a real quick introduction of all of our panelists and thank them preemptively for coming and joining us today. I'll just go down the line here. We have Arturo Bejar, who's the former senior leader for integrity and care at Meta, where he was responsible for child safety, site integrity, security engineering, and customer care across Meta's products. Later on, he became a whistleblower with regard to their internal practices. Next to Arturo, we have Assembly Member Buffy Wicks, who is a member of the California Assembly. She's the chair of the Appropriations Committee and co-author of the California Age Appropriate Design Code, and she represents parts of the East Bay, which is where I'm from. Thank you, Assemblymember Wicks, for joining us today. Going down the line, we have Ravi Iyer, who's the research director for the University of Southern California Marshall School's Neely Center and managing director of the Psychology of Technology Institute. And last but not least, in person here, we have Martin Harris-Hess, who's the head of sector for protection of minors at DG Connect at the European Commission. And then joining us virtually today, we have Julie Selfa, who's the founder and director of Mothers Against Media Addiction, which is a grassroots movement of parents fighting back against media addiction and creating a world in which real life experiences and interactions remain at the heart of healthy childhood. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I want to get these kicked off with at least giving everybody the opportunity to answer one question, and then my hope is that we can turn into more of a discussion, hopefully. So I'll kick things off with a question to Martin. So it's been about a year at this point since the compliance date of the Digital Services Act, or DSA, kicked in. There are some investigations ongoing. We know that protection of minors is one of the key priorities for enforcement. At the same time, you're now dealing with the sudden resignation of Thierry Breton, who had been a big player in DSA enforcement. So can you tell us a little bit about the DSA approach to protection of minors online, and how do you foresee that that work will continue following the departure of the DSA's most visible champion?
Thank you, Rihanna. And before I start talking about the DSA and how this will pan out in the future, just want to echo Gérard's word that it's really encouraging to see such a full house here. It's encouraging for us who are over from Europe to see that we're grappling with these issues, not in isolation, but that it's a bigger issue that I think if we all pull our resources together, then we probably have a bigger impact. And that's really great to see. On the DSA, maybe before I talk about enforcement of the rules, I just quickly explain the rules themselves. So when it comes to the protection of minors, there are two pillars of the rules in the DSA. One applies to all online platforms independent of size, which is a requirement to provide a high level of protection with regards to safety, security, and privacy. As I said, this is not directed as at just the largest platforms, but platforms of all sizes. And we, as the European Commission, have the power under this article to issue guidelines to help the platforms in applying this high level, because especially smaller ones don't necessarily have the resources themselves to kind of work that out and might need some assistance. So we're working on this, and I will probably get the chance later to talk about this a bit more. And then the second pillar is the risk assessment system that applies to designated very large online platforms. And amongst those, we have a number, or the big social media giants that you will have in mind, like TikTok, the two Meta platforms, Snapchat. They're all designated very large online platforms, and they have to undertake they have to diligently, as the law says, assess systemic risks that their service might pose for their users, including children, and assess those risks again against a list of protected values and rights, including the fundamental rights of the child, the protection of minors more largely, but also the physical and mental well-being of their users, and that applies to all users, but of course children are a particularly vulnerable group in that respect. And once they've identified those systemic risks, they have to implement effective mitigation measures against the risks. So measures that reduce the risk, that mitigate the risks. The DSA as such, I would say, is in that respect more of a subtle surgical knife than a machete. That we, as the legislator, or as the enforcer of the legislation, we don't necessarily prescribe what an effective mitigation measure is. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution, but we, like the platforms themselves, need to come to us and say, these are the measures we want to take to mitigate against the risks that we identified, and then we assess whether these measures are effective, and if not, then of course we have the powers to enforce or go into more formal non-compliance decisions. And that leads me to the enforcement that you mentioned. We have already opened in the past year, even though the rules are very new, a number of cases under the DSA and with regards to the protection of minors, most notably against TikTok, against Instagram and Facebook. And in all these cases, we've criticized both a violation or potential violation, because it's so far only a suspicion from us, of the article that I mentioned first, so the high level of safety, security, and privacy, but also that we feel the platforms have not undertaken their risk assessment diligently, and have that the measures they put in place to mitigate against the risks are not effective. And there we have particularly criticized that the design of the service leads to addictive behavior, that it creates rabbit hole of harmful content that could lead to self-harm, to various forms of physical or mental harm of the users. But also that, for example, the privacy settings by default are not sufficiently high to offer the protection that is needed. And we are in the moment at the stage is we're investigating. As you know, when it comes to legal investigations, you have to have a very good evidence base. And I'm looking at Paul John, who would have to defend our cases in court when it comes to it. So we need to make his life as easy as possible by collecting sufficiently robust evidence to underline our cases, if we are of the conclusion in the end that indeed there is a non-compliance. You mentioned Thierry Breton, our former boss, who recently resigned. Indeed, he was a formidable character and a formidable force in championing the DSA vis-a-vis some equally formidable CEOs here in Silicon Valley or in the US or outside the US even more broadly. His resignation, I don't think has any particular impact on our cases. At least they are going on as before. On the political level, I think Gerard mentioned it already, our President Ursula von der Leyen, who will continue to be the president of the Commission in the new Commission as well, she stressed in her political guidelines to the European Parliament that for the mandate for the coming 5 years for the European Commission, the protection of minors will continue to play a very important role, and that resources will be made available to continue our fight against any threats there.
Thanks for that. So I'll move on to Assemblymember Wicks. I think this is actually a pretty good lead-in, actually. 2 years ago, the legislature here in California passed the AADC, the Age Appropriate Design Code Act, authored by yourself, inspired by similar legislation in the UK. The bill was the first of its kind to be passed here in the United States, but since has inspired some similar pieces of legislation in places like Maryland and Vermont. However, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal appellate level court here for the West Coast, recently ruled that some of the law is likely unconstitutional and sent the case back down to the trial court for further determinations. Can you tell us a bit more about the key obligations and provisions contained in the code and walk us through the current legal status of those key provisions and what you see as next steps in both the courts and the legislature, if you're ready to share that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I think this is the second time I've been here talking about this specific topic, and always appreciate the EU's partnership as well as other international actors. I think all of these legislative and regulatory bodies are grappling with how do we keep our kids safe? And that's the fundamental question I think many of us are asking. And I'm the parent of 2 little girls. And so that is what drives me every day in trying to figure this out. They're fortunately still young enough. They're 4 and 7 that we haven't gotten to the age of like the preteen land yet, which I'm like nervous about already. They're very strong-willed. They get it from their mother. But you know, looking at what the world's going to look like for them, I'm just selfishly trying to create a safer environment for my kids and all other children that we know are grappling with these issues, regardless. And I will say, regardless of political ideology, regardless of income, regardless of race, regardless of anything across the board, when you talk to parents about this issue, they want change. And that is why I'm fundamentally, despite the Net Choice suing on this bill, that is why I'm fundamentally actually optimistic that we will create the change that we want to see, because politicians will respond to that. They will respond to their constituents to create a better, safer environment. I think what you're seeing play out in AADC is how exactly do we go about doing that? And there's sort of different, I think, schools of thoughts emerging over the last couple of years around what is the best way to regulate tech as it pertains to our children. You know, I think I would sort of break down into 2 main buckets. The one I subscribe to, which is, you know, this is a consumer protection issue, much like how our federal government or our state government regulate around, you know, formula for babies, or the width of the slats of cribs, or car seats, or all these other things that we give our children, right? I know when I go into a store to buy a car seat that there's federal regulations. So I don't have to say, is this going to be safe for my child or not? I know it is, because there's federal regulation around that. We should expect the same thing from the internet and from the products that our children are consuming and what they're using and what they're looking at on their tablets or their phones, et cetera. And to me, that's the vision of where we need to be. I think the other school of thought is we need more, it's all on the parents to decide. And I think there's an element of that is important, but placing it on the parents takes away the responsibility of the companies. And they say, okay, parents, good luck. Well, if any of you have teens and have tried to negotiate with them on screen time and all the other things, right? It's a very difficult equation. And so I think we need to put the onus back on the companies. The government needs to do that, to say these products need to be made safer. Doesn't mean parental choice shouldn't be a part of the equation. And I think there's absolutely places for that and a space for that. But fundamentally, the products need to be safer for our children. And that's really what AADC is about. And we, you know, I like to think that we're the geniuses here in California, but actually, I just stole this from the UK, age appropriate design. And, you know, I had the luxury of saying, you know, they were a couple of years ahead of us. So they already had all the companies on the record, which is actually helpful when you're going through and thinking through, okay, what are going to be the fault lines? What are going to be the challenges? They had the companies on the record talking about this. They had kicked the tires on the really thorny issues. It's different there because we have the Constitution here in the United States and freedom of speech specifically. So we cannot regulate anything around content. And so that makes it a more of a challenge for us. But looking at what they had done there, how can we do that sort of in a California way or an American way? And really fundamentally the law or the bill and the subsequent law essentially says, products that are likely to be accessed by anyone under the age of 18 need to be made by design and by default safe for kids. That's the default setting at the highest privacy settings, by design and by default safe for kids. As you said, the Ninth Court ruled that there was aspects of that they viewed were concerning with regard to constitutionality, specifically the assessments that were required for the business, because they thought that could be essentially them opining on content. So that was, and the rest was remanded back to the lower court for more opining. So it's caught up in the legal system at the moment. Just a little note about the politics of this. What I have discovered, I've done a number of bills now in this space. I have one sitting on the governor's desk, AB 1949, which is around data privacy as well and how that is collected. And I've done other bills in this space too. What I have seen often is the companies don't come out in opposition to the bill. The trade associations do. And then the trade associations sue, and the companies then say, oh, we didn't oppose it and we're okay with it. The truth of the matter is, I think what we're seeing politically, at least in the California legislature right now, and I sit on the privacy committee. I think we're one of few legislative bodies, I think the only one in the country, I don't know about the rest of the world, where we have a privacy committee that's devoted specifically to this question. I've been on that committee since I got to the legislature 6 years ago. To me, it's the most intellectually interesting committee in the legislature. Don't tell the other committees I said that. It's the most intellectually interesting committee in the legislature because it's genuinely like Democrats and Republicans who are moms and dads who are literally just trying to figure out how we keep our kids safer. That's the driving force behind everyone on that committee, which doesn't exist in politics in America right now. Like, it's sort of the least political place in the building because we're truly grappling with how do we solve this problem. And as we get fought in the courts every step of the way, the temperament of the legislators, myself included, gets more frustrated and more angry and more upset that we have to create this change and more committed to finding that answer. And the lobbyists and the tech companies try really hard to navigate that, but I will say, like, it is going to come because it is truly a bipartisan issue, and we are upset with how things are going with regard to the safety of our children, and we are going to find the solution. What I am likely to do specifically on my bill, because it is in the lower courts now, is to do some cleanup legislation next year, working with the Attorney General, working with the Department of Justice around some of the questions that were raised, adding in what's called a severability clause, things of that nature, making sure explicitly and specifically that this bill is not about speech or content. That is the red line for us here, and it's about product design choice. So things like, this is what we saw in the UK, right? When age appropriate design was implemented in the UK, what we saw was, 55-year-old men can't direct message 13-year-old girls who are not in their network, right? No longer can that happen in the UK. Well, guess what was announced last week, right? A similar protocol, in part because of age appropriate design. That's, I think, what Meta was doing, was responding to some of this, turning off push notifications after a certain time of night, because we know teens are staying up with their phones. They get a push notification, they check it, they respond, it creates this sort of rabbit hole of staying up late. So there's very specific things that that AADC has produced that have nothing to do with speech, that have to do with the product design choice. And so making that very specific and explicit within the context of AADC, so that we're crystal clear around the speech question, I think is something that we need to do, that we will be doing next year. And then, again, keeping the focus on the design features and not on the content, I think is going to be an important part of legislative follow-up that I will be conducting next year. It also has gone through in other states. Elements of it also now are in COPPA. So I think we're seeing the sort of the bigger philosophical approach around this being a consumer protection issue, I think is shining through, despite the fact that the bill's caught up in the courts right now.
Thank you for that. And I appreciate that you mentioned the speech component, which is what makes regulating here so much more difficult because we're talking about something that's fundamentally not the same as regulating tobacco, regulating alcohol, requiring labeling for tobacco, that kind of thing. And the distinction you're trying to draw between speech and design is actually a fairly tricky one. But that leads us into Ravi. I wanted to ask you, you've done a lot of work in research as a data scientist, as a psychologist, and you've looked at the risks and the harms that minors can face online. And I wanted to see if you could share with us, what are some of the most prominent harms and risks that you've been looking into? And then maybe tell us a little bit about the design code for social media that you yourself have authored that has some similarities, some differences to some of the policies that we've just been hearing about from Martin and Buffy. And tell us a little bit about what your recommendations are in that design code and how that ties back to the harms that you've identified.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually, before my current job, I worked at Meta for about 4.5 years. And there are some very concrete ways you can design a product where you see more bullying, harassment, more misinformation. And there are ways you can design a product that you can see less of that. And so I don't, I started there. I worked on all sorts of these, societal issues. I worked on hate speech. I worked in misinformation. I worked in bullying, harassment. Bad things are going to happen online. I don't think we can hold companies responsible every time a bad thing happens online, but I do think we can hold them responsible when they encourage bad things to happen online due to the design of those platforms. And when you see an experiment that a platform runs where they design it one way and they see less bullying harassment and they design it another way and they see more bullying and harassment, well, then it's clear that like one design actually does lead to more systemic risk, less duty of care, whatever the legal standard is. Since then, I've been working with various jurisdictions, read many a law. I'd say there are like 3 categories of harm that I think people are most concerned about with regards to kids. There's unwanted usage, so problematic usage. If you ask kids, about 70% of kids will say that they feel manipulated by these platforms. This is not us saying that you are manipulated. This is them saying they feel manipulated, right? About 50% of kids will say that college students in Minnesota will say that they have a problem with excessive internet use, right? So they're saying, I have a problem with excessive internet use. We're not saying that, we're not imposing our values on them. They are saying that themselves. And so they may not want to be banned from these platforms, but they definitely want more control of these platforms and things like infinite scroll, autoplay, optimizing for time spent. They make those kids feel manipulated. They lead them to use these platforms more than they want. Second kind of harm, unwanted content, harmful content. 19% of kids on Instagram say that they see unwanted sexually explicit content every 7 days. So this is from Instagram's internal research. We don't have those numbers for Snapchat. We don't know that those numbers for TikTok. We should know that number for every jurisdiction, for every platform. And this is not a 16-year-old boy looking for porn online. This is, a kid, it's his unwanted sexually explicit content. This is the average age of pornography exposure. One study was age 12, right? And I'm sure it's probably gone down from then. So this is unwanted sexually explicit content that kids shouldn't be seeing. And the third kind of harm is privacy harms. And that's privacy harms both by the platform where they are serving people unwanted content, using their data in all sorts of different ways that they don't expect, but also privacy harms from other users, right? And so unwanted contact, people are just much more public. A lot of teens just want to talk to their friends, but they're defaulted to these public settings, and that's done really for business reasons. So we put together the design code for social media really to bring some specificity to the design changes that can make these things better. They're informed by many a platform experiment that I've been involved with in our time at Meta. You can read about many of them in the Facebook papers. Many other platforms have done similar kinds of studies. And there have been external studies that also show these same patterns, that if you design a platform for engagement, you often will see more bullying and harassment. You will see more graphic content. You will see more misinformation. And if you optimize a platform for explicit preference, what do I aspirationally want to consume, as opposed to what do I pay attention to, you get a much safer platform. And so there are all sorts of ways that we can design these platforms both to more empower users to have the experiences they want and to stop these platforms being so easily manipulatable by small groups of users who often dominate discourse on these platforms. So that's, a couple of things in our design code. And I'm hopeful that, as we move from these broader concepts like systemic risk or duty of care, and we start to get more specific, like what do we actually want to change in these platforms, we can start to implement some of these design changes.
That leads me into Arturo, another former Meta, maybe recovering Meta employee, perhaps. You also had conducted a lot of research about the impact on minors of using Meta's products. There are a lot of online safety regulations, including the DSA, that entail some amount of internal research being conducted within companies like Meta in order to comply with the provisions of those laws. How do you think that provisions like the transparency requirements in the DSA, for example, or the possibility of documents being shared externally by a whistleblower, how does that affect the research that happens within social media companies about the impact? Like, do you see regulations helping stimulate useful internal research at platforms about how they are affecting kids?
I think we're at a point where the only way this research will happen is through regulation. And so an example of this was when I was in Instagram, there was a study that looked at young girls looking, and they were doom scrolling, that's the internal term for spending over an hour looking at content where bodies were manipulated. So like made to be too thin, lips, all this body image. And they knew that was an issue. There was a product suggested to make it better, which is, after a little bit of time looking at that, let's nudge them into a different topic. And that team submitted that product for review to the executive team within Instagram, and it got shut down. They couldn't do it because of an executive decision for which they provided no documentation. And then based with that, what I tried to do when I was there is I tried to shine a light on understanding the harm that people were experiencing on Instagram. So that number that Ravi spoke about, that 19%, came from a study where what you did is you asked a teenager, did you experience an unwanted sexual advance in the last 7 days? Did you see unwanted, violent, bloody, disturbing content? Did you see nudity? Did you experience bullying and harassment? Have you seen people being hated on because of race, gender, identity, on these issues, to get a sense of how much it was happening? And the numbers that came back were incredible. They were like, the one I talk about all the time, 1 in 8 13 to 15-year-olds get an unwanted advance in Instagram the last 7 days. And instead of continuing that research and doing the work to reduce those numbers, which is what I would expect to happen, in the year after I left, those researchers got laid off, that surveys were stopped, and there's an environment internally where it's hard to understand the harm that people are experiencing. And so my hope with the mandated risk assessment framework, the thing that's amazing of what Ravi is doing in terms of independent research on these issues, having a design code that encourages the thought of creating a product that's actually safe for teens, is how do you incentivize companies to reduce the harm that kids are actually experiencing? Because I can say that from the announcement that came last Tuesday, all of the harms that my daughter experienced firsthand, when she first went on, she created a private account, and she got dick pics and sexual harassment from kids within her network of people, and all of her friends did as well. She experienced bullying and harassment like Carson did, and she asked for help every single time. She did not get help once. She moved into public with my supervision. We talked about what a public account would look like. She wanted to talk about cars. And the comments that she got make me think of this girl I saw recently. This was a 8-year-old girl who was posting videos kind of dancing around. And she said, well, should I take a nap or should I have lunch? And she's a little overweight. And the top comment on that, when we talk about unwanted contact, bullying, and harassment, was, why don't you get a chair and a rope? Now that's a comment that reported would not be taken down. And ultimately, we don't have transparency on understanding this kind of harm as it unfolds on the platforms. And I would live for a day where a kid can say, you know what, I got harassed. It was through comments. I tried submitting a report. I did or did not get help. And you have to design these things in a way that they're kind of content independent, because when you think about threats, if I tell my partner, oh, I'll see you later tonight at home, she's going to be happy to hear that, and it's great. If you get a message from a stranger saying, I'll see you later in your house, it's kind of like the worst threat. Companies have the capacity to make this better. They have the capacity to understand it. They have the capacity to change the design and the features and to have the data that does that. but they're more worried about how they're perceived, about their image, about their option value with the products that they want to be able to make. And we end up in this environment where it's left to us on the outside to prove the harm that we see that our kids experience. And so I just really want to thank everybody here, because it's through your leadership that I believe that change will happen on these products.
Thank you. And Julie, thank you for being super patient while we finally get around to our talking up on the screen there. Can you share your thoughts on the design interventions that Ravi discussed in the categories that he listed, where we have some very heterogeneous types of harms that therefore will require very different types of interventions potentially to be effective? And can you talk about, maybe we haven't talked too much yet about parental controls. Can you give us your thoughts on what's working, what isn't, like what could be done differently for parental controls too?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. And before I get into parent controls, I just wanted to build on what Mr. Behar just said. You know, I came to do this work at Mothers Against Media Addiction because I've spent more than 20 years as a journalist working for many of this country's top news organizations, and I reported on youth mental health and suicide and became deeply alarmed when I began seeing the role of social media in causing adolescents to take their own lives. And as terrible and scary as that was, I became even more concerned when we watched the suicide rate in tweens, which are children as young as 10, tick up, where they have remained. And now 10-year-olds in the United States are more likely to die at their own hands than from every form of cancer combined. I'm a parent. I have spent time with mentally unhealthy children. And so often they are having problems because of their experiences online. The harms that Mr. Ayer mentioned are exactly right. Friends at another nonprofit have actually gone deeper and tried to catalog every specific type of harm they could identify that affects children. And they ended up collecting 18 pages of different harms. So we're not only talking about bullying, which of course is terrible, or self-harm content. And by the way, Meta put out a press release last week about its new teen program. But if you read the entire press release, buried at the bottom is something that I think should have been the headline, which said that they removed 12 million separate pieces of self-harm or suicide content this year, just between April and June. So, you know, when I began reporting on this stuff 5-10 years ago, I didn't have the data available to tell you how often your children were seeing content that encouraged them to cut themselves, to hang themselves, to hurt themselves. Now, at least Meta has begun to share some of that. So, you know, the harms that affect children are wide. And as we all know, media addiction and overuse of screens is not only dangerous because of the specific types of content children are sometimes seeing, but also because of all the time it's displacing when children of every single generation in human history for millennia have used to acquire other skills, interpersonal skills, social and emotional skills, all of the basic building blocks that you need even for academic success. I can't speak to Europe, but sadly in the United States, our reading and math scores of students are going down. And last year, the lowest performing students performed lower than they did back in 1971 when we started measuring it. So as our Surgeon General has said, this is an emergency and we need an all of society response. And I think the policy responses do need to come at a level that addresses the problem in many different ways. Assemblymember Wicks, I'm so grateful for the work that you've done in California. And I just wanted to make one slight, offer one idea about this issue of whether or not we can regulate content. You know, it is not legal to go into a park and ask a child for sex. And it shouldn't be legal to do that online or in any venue. We need to recognize that children are protected class. They deserve to be protected from certain harms. And, you know, the online world has a profound effect. And our regulators have known this since the 1930s when radio was invented and we had our first Communications Act. So I think going forward on a policy level, we're going to have to begin thinking of media environments, not just as social media, as we're calling it, but social media is a form of mass media publishing. We have allowed every human being with access to a phone to become a mass media publisher, and none of them have the same regulations, requirements, or responsibilities that, for example, the New York Times has or the Washington Post has when they publish something. So I really think that's another area that we need to look at. And I certainly welcome parent controls that work. I have a master's degree. I have held down many jobs, and I have never been able to get my parent controls to work. I have 3 sons, and my oldest one was born before there were iPhones and when Mark Zuckerberg worked at a small company called the Facebook. My middle son was born into a world where by the time he was in pre-K, every single parent in the neighborhood had a smartphone and was photographing their children and inadvertently training their children to be photographed constantly and share everything. And now my youngest son is not allowed to have TikToks, but I cannot prevent him from seeing TikToks because his friends message them to him. Snap has gone to shorter and shorter reels. YouTube has gone to shorter and shorter reels. So I think we all have to really think about the media environment that we're creating for our children. And, even the apps that have been sold to parents that are supposed to help. I signed up for one. I spent a week connecting all my children's accounts, and I was supposed to get an email when they were exposed to harmful content and started getting over 100 emails a day. And that's when I knew we had a problem. So at Mama, we're open to an array of policy options, but we think the most important thing is to recognize, just as was said earlier by Assemblymember Wicks, that these are products and there needs to be consumer protections, just like with every other consumer product.
Thanks very much for that. I'll pick up on something that you mentioned that is also federally illegal to solicit sex from children online. And one of the few pieces of bipartisan legislation to have passed this year was a law called the Report Act that now will mandate that online service providers do have to report that kind of online enticement to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, just the same as they already have to report when they detected child abuse imagery that occurs online. So we're seeing some incremental movements get the ball further down the field, even at the federal level. I want to turn back to Martin and bring up one of the most difficult and intractable questions about trying to protect children online, which is figuring out who is a kid and who is not a kid. How do minors access platforms? How do they use things differently? This is something that potentially could be determined by the platform itself, but they have to figure out which users are children in the first place with some reasonable degree of assurance. However, the French privacy regulator, the CNIL, wrote 2 years ago that there don't seem to be any currently known options for age verification online that are effective and reliable, but that also adequately protect the privacy, cybersecurity, and other rights of internet users, particularly in light of what we were just hearing about from Julie. There are so many options available, such as VPNs, to hide the geographic location of somebody, or otherwise to try and circumvent measures for age verification or age estimation. Can you describe for us the EU approach and take on age verification, age estimation, age assurance? There are all these different methods out there. And how are you working with platforms about what to do in terms of implementing these? And have there been any advances in trying to balance all of these different competing values, all of which, people have these various fundamental rights, so do children, in the last couple of years since the CNIL wrote about this sort of intractable difficulty with this technology?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Age verification, age assurance is a complex issue, especially if you want to have the balance between privacy and the reliability of your estimation or verification, if possible, even. Maybe just to jump back, because I mentioned earlier the 2 kind of centerpieces of protection of minors in the DSA. The DSA itself, so our legal instrument, does not prescribe age verification or age assurance as an obligation per se. But if you look at how to provide a high level of protection, this is the first one for all online platform, the first rule I mentioned, or as an effective risk mitigation measure, there are certain scenarios, I think, where a platform has to implement some form of age assurance or age verification in order to address the risks that they have identified, in order to prevent children to access age inappropriate content. And in my view, at least, certain forms of age verification are the only way to be compliant with the DSA in these circumstances. And that's why we also, and recognizing the difficulty when it comes to privacy, is why we're working on an age verification solution with member states, with industry in the European Commission. And we have advanced this work. It is still ongoing. We hope to come up with what we call short-term solution by mid next year. So just it's getting quite technical. I'm a lawyer, so I have to be careful not to misrepresent what's going on. But the idea is that you have a double zero knowledge proof concept where you get a verification or a certification of your age, and we start with 18 plus because there it's a bit easier because in member states there are every person over 18 has to have a national identity card, for example. So there is a way of certifying your age. So you get from a recognized certification provider, you get the age certification on your phone. And then when you want to access content that is for adults only, we will require those content providers to ask for the certification. When the content provider asks the user for the certification, it does not know the identity of the user. It just knows probably the IP address, but and then gets the certification. And the certification provider does not know for which purpose you want the certification. I mean, pornography is one example, but there could be other types of adult content which are more around extreme violence. There could be dating apps, for example. You can want to buy alcohol online or various things that you should not do if you're under 18. This is based on the technical solution is based on a law that has been adopted in, I think it was April this year, which introduces a European identity wallet. And based on the technical standards for this wallet, this age verification certificate happens. And we just want to advance this work because this identity wallet is not due to be implemented until 2026. And we just want to advance that work to have it ready sooner so that at least for the 18 plus age verification, we have a solution sooner that is privacy friendly. And we're working with you probably know that in Europe we have quite high data protection rules, and we're working with our European Data Protection Board. They are in the board, they would be developing this solution with us, so to make sure it's privacy friendly. And just one add-on before I pass the mic on is, we're talking now about 18 plus age verification, but of course when it comes to social media, it is not just if you're over 18. Most social media platforms say in their terms and conditions themselves, our services should not be used by children under 13. Now, and they say that in their risk assessment to us, it's too dangerous, too risky for children under 13 to have access to the content we provide. Well, if they say that, we expect them to put mitigation measures in place to enforce that. If it's their own assessment. So you have to, as a social media company, have something in place that assures yourself that whoever uses your service is at least 13.
Thank you. I think that under 13 issue is one of the areas that is most underexplored right now from what I've seen in discourse. And part of it is there's a lot of talk about verification, but an area that is not talked about enough is how many accounts there are on services like Instagram of kids that are under 13. If you search for hashtag 8th birthday, right? You will find accounts. You watch some of those reels, and then reels will recommend to you thousands of accounts. I did testing about this myself earlier in the year. So reels actually would be a very good technology to find those accounts if there was a proactive discovery effort on part of the platform, which they need to do because that's a risk. The other area that if you're a regulator or have any kind of discovery authority that I would strongly encourage that you look at is whether a reporting tool is a tool that actually helps you address an issue or whether it's therefore like to say that they have it. So in Instagram, if you look at a reel, what you have to do, and you realize it's a minor, it's clear, you can't do it from the reel, you have to go into the profile, then you have to say something about the account, then you have to say the account is under 13, then you have to click out to the help center, and you have to click into a form, and in the form you have to copy and paste the name of the account and the birth year of the child. And so one of the things that you can do from a discovery perspective is you could ask how many people initiate that process versus how many people finish it, because it's not an effective reporting tool if the completion rate of somebody who has identified a minor account is in this case likely like a fraction of a percent. But I hope that there's a lot of attention on the processes and discovery of minor accounts.
Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more, because I know that the age estimation is also part of the AEDC.
Yeah.
And one of the concerns is you're just gathering more information about children that might then be subject to a data breach or cybersecurity incident. And I'd love to hear from you, Assemblymember Wicks, about how, especially as part of the Privacy Committee, how you think about reconciling these needs for privacy and
Yeah.
security along with the.
And this is a thorny issue, right? And I think I subscribe to both very strict privacy protections as well as keeping your kids safe online. You know, I fundamentally believe the companies know how old their users are. Like they literally have thousands of engineers devoted to knowing exactly who's on their platform and what they like and what they look up and all of these questions, right? I mean, they have the best engineers in the world devoted to this exact question. So they know how old their users are. On the age estimation question, you know, that's about mandating that the info companies already collect is used to provide age appropriate experiences. So they already collect a lot of this data to begin with. And also mandating that the deletion of sensitive data used to estimate age, which is not currently required. You know, one of the things that I'm exploring, that there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, looking at this notion of really an upstream approach. So we're requiring that the operating system send a signal to the apps when those get downloaded that says this person's under the age of 13 or they're between 13 and 15, or you could sort of require a bracket of time of age rather, that would then ensure that, you know, Android and Apple are actively being part of the solution as well in terms of signaling to the apps this person shouldn't be able to download, you know, Instagram if they're under the age of 13, to your point. So I think there's other ways too that we need to tackle this problem, but it's one that we've grappled with. You know, there was a lot of, when I was doing AADC, there was a lot of fear mongering around this question of like, oh my gosh, now if this goes into effect, every website that every person goes to is going to require your driver's license. You're going to have to upload it, a government ID, which obviously is not the case. And it's not the case in the UK. Like the internet didn't collapse when AADC went into effect in the UK. It's not going to collapse here. And I think there are technology solutions. So that's one of the issues that I'll potentially be working on next year, is around this idea of signaling and requiring the upstream approach that would send the age, the approximate age to the app as it's downloaded.
Thanks. I want to have a follow-up on that. And then I also wanted to hear from you, Ravi, about whether, you know, we've been talking about making the most privacy protective settings for children. Would we all benefit if those sorts of settings were by default for everybody? We don't have a federal level general data protection law in the United States, but I was wondering if you could speak to that does designing something that would protect children, would that also help protect everybody?
Yeah, I mean, first, let me just weigh in plus one what Buffy said about device-based verification. I actually think it is a privacy risk for every app to be trying to figure out how old you are. It'd be great if you could set up a phone, your phone knew how old you were, and it told every app how old you were or what level of protection or what age range you were. I think it would eliminate a lot of the privacy risk. I think a lot of parents and families, I have 3 kids myself, you know, I could set it up with my kids. I can't figure out the settings for every app. I could figure that out. You know, that's like about my level of sophistication. And so I think, you know, there's a perfect's the enemy of the good situation here, where like we could do a lot of good for a lot of parents who just want the, you know, if they could just apply the common sense media settings for every user who indicates that they want them for their kids. You know, I think we could solve a lot of these problems without all the technical issues about like, you know, who's lying about their age and who's trying to get around it. As far as your question about, you know, would these help other issues? 100%. You know, so our design code actually, you know, I think it will have good impact on kids. It'll also have impact on elections. And what these things have in common is that there's often a small group of users who are trying to harm others, right? Misinformation, bullying and harassment, sexual solicitation. These are all things that, you know, most people are not trying to do these things. It's a small group of people who are hyperactive, trying to do these things, amplifying each other. And, you know, things like loose rate limits, which is in our design code, things like lack of accountability, lack of negative feedback. These are all things that allow small groups of people to dominate a space so that these systems are not democratic and they don't reflect the majority of people who are not out to hurt kids and are not out to hurt democracy as well. And the second sort of mechanism is engagement-based algorithms, right? And so that's what our design code, I was really thrilled to see the California legislator, the governor signed the bill about, regulating these algorithms. The same engagement-based algorithms that lead kids to want to be more sexual than they necessarily want to be to get more attention are the same algorithms that get purveyors of misinformation to, say whatever they want to get more ad revenue, right? It's the same mechanism. So if we can address these two design elements of platforms and fix them, we'll both fix our impact on elections and our impact on our kids.
Thanks. And before we move to our final question and then open it up for Q&A, I want to hear from Julie, if you could maybe give us some feedback or thoughts on what Ravi was just saying about the potential for maybe like what's been called middleware, for example, where maybe you have Common Sense Media or another organization that might provide some sort of presets so that parents don't have to go app by app or device by device.
So I love the idea of a device-based setting. I think that it's overdue for device manufacturers to allow parents to just click a single button and say, this phone is being used by a child. It would solve so many problems. Same at the App Store. If right now I have parent controls on my phone, Apple already knows how old my child is. Why is the App Store promoting apps to the child that are not even supposed to be for kids that young? It makes no sense. So certainly I think, there's things we can do at multiple levels here. In terms of the harms, I mean, I of course agree that there are just a small number of bad actors, and unfortunately they have an outside influence. But I also think that the array of harms just keeps growing, and with AI and increasing use of generative AI, we're just going to keep seeing more and more. Right now, fentanyl deaths are up in the United States, and that's largely because of dealers on Snap. According to the CDC, we're now losing one classroom full of kids each week to what are called fentanyl overdoses, although the parents whose kids have died like to call them murders. We are seeing a rise in sextortion. And, with technology and the ability to be anonymous, the ability to reach across oceans and touch people at volume, at scale, I think that we're always going to have new harms that we didn't anticipate. So I think the critical thing here is to ensure that the regulations have a basic framework. I really like the framework that's promoted by the Center for Countering Digital Hate. They call it the STAR framework. So there's safety by design, there's transparency, there's accountability, and there's responsibility for the companies and their executives. So, I think we need policies at all levels. And at MAMA, we also recognize that policy alone is not going to solve these problems. Parents need to understand that there's a time and a place for technology use, because we all didn't really understand how these things work. And I admit, I lied about my child's age to let him get on an app so he could get in touch with his cousins. I thought that was an okay thing to do. I did not realize that it would expose them to so much harmful content. So I think a device-based age rating that parents can put in is great. I think devices themselves that are made for children and not, providing access to the entire internet, because there's just no way we're going to be able to regulate everything on the internet. And as long as the internet provides every single kind of information and access to everything in the whole world, if we want to protect childhood, if we want to defend children's right to grow up and not be exposed to everything all at once before they've even gone through puberty, we need to recognize that tech is not always appropriate for kids.
Thanks. And let's stick with Julie for our last just rapid fire round of questions. We spent a lot of time talking about shortcomings and problems, but I'd like to maybe end on a more optimistic note, which is, could each of you, starting with Julie, and we'll just come right back over to me, quote, one child safety feature or change that has caught your interest, maybe even specify what particular app or platform that you think could constitute a best practice to protect minors online. So where are some hopeful examples that you've seen?
I'll say the most hopeful thing has not been from a company lately, because I find it kind of disappointing that the companies only roll out new safety mechanisms moments before the federal government is about to pass a regulation. But how thrilled I am that the US Senate passed COSA by such a wide majority, and that was a tripartisan supported bill. So this is not a partisan issue in the United States. Maybe it's the last thing that's not a partisan issue, but we all seem to agree that we need to protect kids. And ever since Mama got started, we just can't keep up with the interest from parents who really want to make change. So I'm very hopeful about that.
Thank you. Yeah, we have seen quite a number of changes in response to the DSA that go in the right direction. I think not a single one by itself is solving the problem, but cumulatively, I think we are, to kind of stay with your picture of painting a more positive picture, we're going in the right direction. I think if I had to single out one, is the DSA actually requires companies to offer the option of a non-personalized fees. And when it comes to what Ravi said earlier, I think for children, I really don't see why you have to have algorithms based on maximum engagement. They just are too risky to provide content that harms the children. So I think a non-personalized, so almost dumb algorithm for children, I think would be a good way to start.
So I'll also go in the realm of algorithms. We recently wrote a paper with a number of other platforms as well as academics about alternatives to engagement-based algorithms. I actually do think that there's a role for personalization. Sometimes you can personalize things to give people more age-appropriate content or to remove bad experiences that are personal to them. But I think the objective function of an algorithm should not be more time on the platform. It should be quality, it should be connection, it should be information. And so there are platforms that are attempting to optimize for these things. They're harder, it requires investment, but I'm hopeful that, you know, the actions of our legislature, the actions of the legislature in New York, the DSA, we can give the platforms the motivation to invest in these other ways, other things to optimize for quality, not just for time spent. And I'm excited there are platforms investing in that right now.
I would say it's the determination, dedication, and willpower of the California legislature and the governor, despite being home of the tech industry, to continue to push for regulation in an aggressive way. And a real strong commitment to that. That is truly bipartisan, I think is exciting. And despite some of the setbacks of legal challenges and others, there is a commitment to that. And I think we are proud that we are going to continue to push the envelope on this, even when it takes our federal partners much longer. And hopefully California can continue to lead the way to push for sensible regulation to keep our kids safe online.
So I'm going to take this to talk about the future I wish the most that would exist, and I would be able to talk about it now, which is in every kid's DMs, and really in everybody's DMs, there should be a button that says, you know, that message is not for me. Why? Because it's a little creepy, it's a little gross, it's just, and the content doesn't really matter. It's just a way for you to signal that that's not for you. 4 weeks ago, somebody wrote my daughter asking her to sell nudes, and there was nothing she could get help with through the product. But what does give me hope is all of you and all of everybody else here, and I believe that change will happen.
Thanks for terrific comments. Can we get a round of applause for our panel before we get to Q&A? And then, are we using this? Okay. How long do we have for questions?
I think we can take 10, 15 minutes.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. That's okay. We also have some questions online, so you can keep them coming. I will read them for you.
Ian Corby from the Age Verification Providers Association, and our mission is to make the internet age aware. I've been doing this for 5 years, and I think one of the reasons we haven't made much progress on making the internet age aware is because of this perpetual argument about who is responsible. Should it be the platform? Should it be the parents? And I think that comes perhaps from thinking there might be just one solution, when in fact, perhaps the answer is that there are multiple solutions. But if you had to pin the responsibility on one party or one place in the technical stack, who do you think should primarily be responsible for protecting our kids online, the publisher or the parent?
the publisher, when you think of all of the different ways there are to access the product, I mean, there's phones, there's web browsers, there's everything like that. The publisher has to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of answered this already. I strongly believe it's a consumer protection issue. The companies have to be responsible for this, and the government will regulate that so that they are responsible.
I think companies and device makers need to make it easy, and then parents will do what is natural and protect their kids. But if you don't make it easy for parents, then they're not gonna be able to do it.
I can just echo this. I mean, the providers are the ones creating the risks, so they have a responsibility to address them. And the parents, of course, have to do their part, but I think in this case, I would say the provider too.
If I could just add in there, you know, as a parent, we're responsible for feeding our children nutritious foods, but none of us believe that a parent is responsible for making sure that there isn't sawdust or ground glass in baby formula. This is a huge issue, and no parent is possibly capable of making sure these platforms are safe. So we got a question online. Somebody said, why don't we just ban social media for kids under 16? And, you know, that's another approach. Maybe we just need to accept that social media is not appropriate for kids under 16. If it's going to be designed the way it is now, you know, we know even many adults are addictive and are not able to manage it. So maybe it's not for kids.
I'll be happy to deliver the mic in the front, and then we'll go to you.
In some of the research from Thorn, I was very appalled to find out the amount of access kids have to 18 plus sites, because they're just using their parents' login or using another device. So can you talk a little bit about that at all? You know, you're heading towards a place where companies that know 13 plus is online, and then there's going to be better policy. But what about, how do we police potentially kids that are in environments that they like gambling or anything that they shouldn't even be on?
And
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge is it's sort of a Swiss cheese approach, right? Like, we have to do a lot of different things to keep our kids safe online. There's going to be a lot of different components to this. There's age estimation, age verification, there's the signaling idea, there's all these sorts of things. I don't think one thing's going to solve all the problem. I do think so we don't want to make perfect enemy of the good, right? I think that's actually really important, that it's going to be multiple things. We're not going to catch every problem here. There's a lot of dynamics that we're dealing with. But if someone has one of these, if a 14-year-old has one of these in their pockets, you know, bring about as much thoughtful regulation guardrails into this space for them that we can, is what we should be aiming to do. We know some kids are going to access their parents' tablet, you know, or their parents' computer or their parents' whatever, and that is going to happen. But the majority of kids now are getting phones, or they're getting tablets, or they're getting access online in their own pocket at a much younger age. So I think we don't want to make perfect enemy of the good. The other thing that, and I don't know if this is a well-received policy or not, I will say as a parent, I like it, and I'm just going off gut instinct. I like the idea of limiting phones at schools. And you're seeing that in a lot of different states right now, of saying, like, we're going to check in our phones when we get there. We're going to check them out at whatever time we leave, to the end of not making perfect enemy of the good. We know that some kids now are bringing burner phones to check them in so they can keep their phones. So we're not going to catch all 100%, but if we can keep 98% of our kids off their phones in the middle of the day, and the data on this is super interesting. Norway has done it. Some other districts are starting to do it. We passed a law here this year in California that's going to go into effect in 2026, requiring districts to limit access to phones during school time, which is exciting. The data is showing, like, kids are now actually gasp talking to each other. You know, like, they're playing, they're interacting, they're learning social skills because they're not connected to their device all the time during recess and lunch and all these other things. So again, I don't think any one thing's going to solve all the problems, but in as much as we can do to create this sort of layered effect of smart regulation, that will help the majority of young people. If anyone else wants.
And everybody shouldn't have to feel like you all weigh in on every single one. Anybody else want to take this one? No? Okay, great. Okay, we had the next question. Oh yeah, and then I'll bring this to you after that. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for the talk today. So I'm Mathilde, I'm chief scientist at Everyone.ai, and I guess, like, we've talked about the fact that we know that tech solutions have a potential harmful impact, both short-term and long-term, on children. And yet right now, we can deploy a solution to millions of kids. And I'm a child psychologist and a neuroscientist. And so if I want to see whether or not a tech solution is harmful on a child, and I would want to run it on 500 kids ethically, I cannot do it, which is great. I shouldn't be able to do it if there's any potential harms. Yet a tech company can use that same solution and deploy it to millions of kids at once. So I guess my question is it utopist or like me being a dreamer to hope that one day before you can deploy a solution to millions of kids, you would have to show first that it is safe for them to use? Or is it something that's somewhere in the future or not really?
So I don't think you're a dreamer. I actually think every tech company, before they launch any product, does an experiment, and they have A/B tests. They have hundreds, thousands of A/B tests running every time. And we just need the access to them so that we can understand, just like they do, what is the effect of designing your product one way versus another way, and should it be rolled out to millions of kids or not, right? So they do that to understand if it hurts product metrics. We just need to know the exact same answer of whether it hurts the metrics that are of interest to society.
10 years ago, there used to be something called the compassion team at Facebook. And the job that was to build, for example, a bullying flow that helped a teenager feel supported. But who were we as product managers or engineers to know what that entailed? So what we did is we brought in child psychologists and researchers, put them in as contractors, which made the right security and privacy considerations around that. We agreed under which grounds they could publish, again, very sensitive to privacy. But having the brain of somebody who understands an intervention in a school that helps a child navigate a bullying incident was invaluable to build a product that when something bad happened, the child would feel supported. I believe that work all should happen in transparency, that the fact that this work now is being done under NDAs and secrecy around it, the only reason there's such secrecy around harm inside platforms is, I think, to avoid embarrassment for the executive team. Because if we all understood the harm and if we all understood the interventions and what worked and what didn't, then we could feel at ease with having our kids be there and also kind of move the environment towards innovation in a way that's very possible if they choose to do that.
Yeah, and just coming back to this risk assessment that I mentioned earlier, this is a kind of what we expect of the platforms to do already. So if they have a product to offer, they have to do this risk assessment. And I think, for me at least, this risk assessment would entail, if you have something that you want to give to children, speak to child psychologists, test it, and as Ravi said, this testing is done in the companies anyway. I mean, they have A and B testings for all sorts of things. So why not safety for children as well? And under the DSA, you don't only have to do this every year. So there's a regular risk assessment cycle. You have to do that also when you introduce a new feature to your thing that could have an impact. And there I'm using this opportunity now to kind of boast a bit about a success we had recently. TikTok introduced a new app in the EU, or actually only in France and in Spain, which is called TikTok Lite, which in itself was not a problem. It was a less data hungry app, but it had a reward feature that basically gave you virtual points for watching videos, for liking content, and you can convert those points into Amazon vouchers. So there was a financial incentive to actually use that service. They claimed it wasn't available for 18-year-olds, but we under 18-year-olds, but we kind of doubted that their age assurance mechanisms were effective enough. And we said to them, you have not done a risk assessment. You didn't show us before you introduced this how you deal with this. What are your mitigation measures? And we gave them 48 hours and said, you have 48 hours time to respond, or we threatened them to use interim measures, which is one of the powers we have under the DSA. And lo and behold, 47 hours passed and they withdrew the app from the market. And then came with commitments that they would not reintroduce a reward feature like this again, which we made binding under the DSA.
We'll take another question here in the room and then we'll switch to online Q&A.
Thank you. Thanks for all that you guys are doing. I'm Kavya Porobin, founder and CEO of XRSI. We are focused on advanced emerging technologies. So today, everything that I heard is great, but there is sense of, I don't know if it's just me, but technology is moving way faster than even I can keep up. And I have a master's in cybersecurity, and I used to work for Meta in 2016 doing third-party security. Democracy is not just influence, but kids too. So my question is, what do you think we can do to future-proof everything that you just discussed? Because the convergence of artificial intelligence, I may be the only one wearing smart glasses here, but more of us are probably going to do that in the near future. So how are we going to take everything that you're saying and apply it to these newer platforms that are absolutely going to be here in near future? And how are we thinking about this from legal, from other perspectives?
Well, I'm a little biased because I wrote the bill, but this is what I really like about age appropriate design is it is technology neutral. It is basically that if you have a product that's likely to be accessed by children, it has to be by design and by default safe for children, right? With the risk assessment, the analysis of the companies, and then making that product by design and by default safe for children. So it applies to AI. It applies to any technology product likely to be accessed by children. And I think that's an important point because, first of all, legislators, I think the average age is in the 60s, right? And no offense to my older colleagues, but they are not digital natives in the way that I think younger people are, right? So there's an inherent issue there in terms of understanding the scope for some legislators. We also do not move at a rapid pace on this stuff, right? We have a democracy that's designed to be slow and intentional and thoughtful. So it is hard for us to regulate. It's hard for us to legislate on an issue, on a technology, because 6 months from now, it is obsolete. And that's why I think building in flexibility like that, like how AADC does, I think is actually really, really important. And making it more technology neutral is important because this stuff innovates. Again, these companies they have thousands of engineers designed to make the next product as quickly as humanly possible. They're competing with other companies that have thousands of engineers that are designed to do that. And they're all trying to go to market as fast as they possibly can. And our democratic institutions aren't designed to deal with that. And so that's why I think flexibility with accountability within the construct of the law that we're trying to do, the regulation we're trying to pass, is really, really important.
Thank you, Julie and Ben Ravi. Go ahead, Julie.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing the moderator's voice. At MAMA, we describe ourselves as a grassroots movement of parents and allies fighting back against media addiction and creating a world where real life experiences remain at the heart of a healthy childhood. And we have that description because it isn't an overstatement to say that we're really facing this crisis in sort of where we are in humanity and whether we're going to have a tech future that's completely dominated by a handful of companies that have enormous budgets and that are fixated on constantly rolling out new products, or we're going to center other values, which are human first values, and making space for the basic needs of humanity, basic human rights, and human safety. An overarching question about policy that is different in the EU than the United States, as I understand it, is that historically in the EU, before new products are introduced, they have to be shown to be safe. Whereas in the United States, we let anybody introduce anything, and then the burden of getting it removed from the market is on the consumer who has been injured or hurt. And so this means we're always playing catch up. And so I think at some point, our policymakers are going to have to move to a system where, as the questioner asked earlier, can we first insist that people test products and show they are safe before we are allowing people to introduce them to the public? And for example, AI is exactly that situation. We have some of the founders of AI, the inventors of AI, saying the products are not yet safe. They create hallucinations is the word they use to describe what's happening in the machines. But in terms of the human impact, what that means is they spread misinformation. And so we already have Google, all of these companies promoting AI, integrating AI into social media apps. There are chatbots now that children have started to use, which completely blurs reality and makes it very confusing. And if you can believe it, one of my colleagues was approached at a talk she just gave recently at a prestigious high school in the United States by a student asking for help because a 14-year-old friend of hers had fallen in love with an AI character and needed professional help. So as crazy as that sounds, I think that's something that we're going to be seeing more and more, and agree that we're going to have to sort of make a choice between what we want to prioritize here, whether it's just endless innovation and profits or a human first approach to how we regulate.
Thanks. Let's wrap up with Ravi and then with Arturo.
I'll just say real quickly, technology changes, people don't. And so a lot of these design principles are about how do we allow small groups of people. Most people are good people. Most people will continue to be good people. But how do we allow small groups of people to affect all of us? And how do we design products that don't allow that to happen is something that is timeless, that will be true for AI and it'll be true for the technology after that. The other thing is like the confusion of the usage of a product with value from a product, right? That's a lot of what engagement-based systems are about. Are we going to build AI that is optimized for getting you to talk to a chatbot longer, or for something that gives you something that contributes to your life in some other way, right? And then, just to concretely, what does it look like to understand these things? I mentioned product experimentation. I just want to put a plug for a law we passed in the state of Minnesota recently that would give us access to the product experimentation data of companies. And I think that is how we actually understand what are the choices that these companies are making, whether it's a social media company, whether it's an AI company, whatever the technology is after that. Getting access to that experimentation data is how we future-proof these laws and learn alongside these companies.
This has been one of the central questions of my life. When I first went to work at Yahoo, like almost 30 years ago, had to deal with the first cross-site scripting attack, like N years before, probably 3 or 4 years before it had a name. So the first mail virus, botnets, all these things happen over time. When I got to Facebook, realized it was different because the name used to be, how do you protect people from hackers or things like that? And you realize, humans are going to be human with each other and stuff will happen if you get enough of them together. I think ultimately the way that is sustainable to figure out sort of these harms is to really listen and have good process for people who ask for help. And an example I was talking to Christine earlier today is in Facebook, when this website goes down, there's something called a self-review meeting where engineers and everybody gets together and says, what do we have to learn from this so it doesn't happen again? Yet this doesn't happen when a child dies because they took a challenge or because they were bullied or the reasons we know about. I believe if there was a good process and transparency around when people ask for help of these platforms, we would get good advance warning of the harms as they begin to happen, rather than being in the world we live today, where reporting flows are on the tail end of harm, where harm has to be bad enough to be codified into a policy that then turns into a prevalence report. So I think we just need to listen to people and have transparency around that.
Looks like, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Sorry to our folks viewing online, but one more round of applause for our terrific panelists today. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for taking the time. I feel like we could have gone all afternoon, but that's all we've got for today. So thank you all so much for joining us today.